Today, we're going to be talking about the diffusion of an innovation, and I'm going to use an innovation that has been instrumental in my life, the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA. The ADA was passed in 1990, and it ensured the equal treatment and equal access of people with disabilities in employment and public accommodations. The ADA intended to prohibit discrimination on the basis of disability in many areas, including employment, services, places of public accommodation, transportation, and communication services. This was a huge innovation for people with disabilities at the time. However, it took a long diffusion process that took decades. The innovation of the ADA was possible because a number of people with physical and mental disabilities formed the disability rights social movement working toward the ADA. The disability rights social movement is the innovation that I will be talking about throughout my presentation. As we have been studying diffusion, we see that diffusion is about the way an innovation is communicated over time among the members of a social system. One important aspect of the diffusion of innovation is its newness. This is what makes diffusion distinct. However, newness implies uncertainty, and the disability rights movement was certainly uncertain at the early disability rights activists. They were trying to form a new innovation, a social movement to achieve their political and social goals. There are four main elements in the diffusion of innovation. The first is the innovation. According to Rogers, an innovation is an idea, practice, or object that is perceived as new by an individual or other unit of adoption. Like I said, the disability movement and the idea that where people with disabilities should have the same rights was certainly an idea that combated decades of stigmatization. The disability movement is the innovation. However, the idea wasn't diffused, as I will discuss later, until many individuals and organizations worked together to form the ADA. As we've discussed, technology, according to Rogers, is designed for instrumental action that reduces the uncertainty in the cause-effect relationship involved in achieving a desired outcome. One could argue that the adoption of the ADA was a technological innovation. The second and third element in the diffusion process is communication channel and time. I will discuss the communication channel of the ADA later, but first I want to touch on time. Here we see that the innovation decision process, which according to Rogers consists of knowledge, persuasion, decision, and implementation and confirmation. The diffusion process to get to ADA took a long time to pass through the innovation decision process. This was mainly because society had biased assumptions, harmful stereotypes, and many irrational fears of people with disabilities. Because the stigmatization marginalized people with disabilities in society, and similarly to other oppressed minorities, people with disabilities experience severe impoverishment. For example, in the 1800s, people with disabilities were labeled as tragic, meager, and pitiful, who were unfit and unable to contribute to society. They were thought to be abnormal and feeble minded, and many were forced to be sterilized. They also forced people with disabilities into institutions and asylums where many lived out the remainder of their lives. This so called purification, and segregation of people with disabilities were considered merciful actions at the time, but ultimately they served to keep people with disabilities invisible and hidden from society. Understanding the history of ADA and how disability moved from being excluded in society to being integrated into all aspects of life will help us understand the diffusion process and how it moved from knowledge to implementation. It wasn't until after World War I that we began to see a shift when veterans returning from war with a disability expected the U.S. government to provide rehabilitation services in exchange for their service. Beginning in the 1930s, many new advancements in technology and government assistance programs emerged, which helped contribute to people with disabilities becoming self-reliant and self-sufficient. In fact, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt was the first president with a disability. Although he was a great advocate for people with disabilities, he still believed in the stigmatization that disability was an abnormal, shameful condition and that it should be medically cured or fixed. Beginning in the 1940s and 1950s, after World War II, there was an increased pressure from veterans to provide rehabilitation and vocational training for people with disabilities. Here we begin to see a shift in the social norms of disabilities as World War II veterans made disability issues more visible to the U.S., who were concerned for the long-term welfare of young men who sacrificed their lives to secure the safety of the U.S. By the 1960s, disability advocates began to join forces with other minority groups to demand equal treatment, equal access, and equal opportunity for people with disabilities. It was still very informal in structure, however, as many disability rights activists began to mobilize on the grassroots level and demanded national initiatives to address the physical and social barriers that face the disability community. In 1970s, disability advocates lobbied Congress and marched on Washington to include civil rights language for people with disabilities into the 1972 Rehabilitation Act. In 1973, the Rehabilitation Act was passed, and for the first time in history, civil rights of people with disabilities were protected by law. In the 1980s, disability advocates lobbied for the consolidation of legislation to be under one broad civil rights statute to protect the civil rights of people with disabilities. This was similar to what the 1964 Civil Rights Act did for Black Americans. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibited discrimination on the basis of race, religion, national origin, or gender, but it did not include people with disabilities in the protections. In 1990, after a decade of lobbying, the ADA was passed. With this piece of legislation, the U.S. government identified the full participation, inclusion, and integration of people with disabilities into all levels of society. What we see is that the disability rights movement was slow to be adopted. As we have discussed, the rate of adoption is usually measured by the length of time required for a certain percentage of members of a system to adopt an innovation. The ADA took decades to be adopted. There were many reasons for this. First off, there are many barriers into claiming the identity of a person with a disability and to join collectively to raise awareness for political action. People with disabilities are disproportionately poor, unemployed, uneducated, and dispersed socially. Many individuals live in institutions where settings are dominated by service providers without the ability to interact with others. Further, disability isn't a unitary label. For example, people with physical disability may share similar problems of stigma and exclusion as someone who is deaf or blind, but the practical accommodations vary and may be inconsistent. Despite these impediments, many people with disabilities united around the shared goals of independence and respect. This led to the formation of a broad cross-disability social movement beginning in the 1960s, when local groups of people with different disabilities came together to push for more rights. However, special education classes and vocational rehabilitation agencies still lumped all people with disabilities together for education and other social activities, even though the different disabilities had different needs. While lumping individuals with differing disabilities together across disability lines is good in terms of service, it had the unforeseen consequences of promoting a collective identity, which in the end is harmful. One may ask how this collective identity occurred, particularly in the 1960s, of people with disabilities being lumped together in institutions and service programs, and hardly deviating from the asylum of the Middle Ages. The idea of a collective identity emerged based on other models of civil rights social movements of the era, particularly movements for equal rights for blacks and women. They shaped the disability framework of political action. The disability rights movement was reinvented from other movements to model people with disabilities. However, this reinvention wasn't changed to the extent that it lumped all people with disabilities into one category. And so that was certainly a consequence of this reinvention. I want to go back to the second element in the diffusion process that I mentioned earlier. And the second element in the diffusion of an innovation is communication channel. And this ties in with the fourth element in the diffusion process, which is a social system. As we discussed, one important part of the diffusion process, according to Rogers, is the information exchange through which one individual communicates a new idea to one or several others. This process involves the innovation, which is the disability rights movement, an individual or other unit of adoption that has knowledge of or has experience using the innovation, which in this case would be people with disabilities, another individual or other unit that does not yet have knowledge of or experience with the innovation, which in this case would be the government, and a communication channel connecting the two units, which would be the disability rights organizations. Here we see that the interpersonal channel between people with disabilities, disability organizations, and the government are much more effective when it comes to persuading to adopt the idea of the ADA. The social system had major implications on the diffusion of the ADA in terms of the treatment and the perception of people with disabilities. According to Rogers, a social system is defined as a set of interrelated units that are engaged in a joint problem solving to accomplish a common goal. In the case of the ADA, these include individuals, informal groups, and organizations. Although there were many individuals who advocated for disability rights, it wasn't until the organizations got involved that the disability rights movement began to make changes. The national and local organizations acted on behalf of people with disabilities. However, they were inconsistent as they shifted and dissolved around different issues in the political climate. The disability rights movement was initially a loosely coupled network of organizations whose goals and objectives were focused on empowerment and collective rights. These include human, civil, and legal rights for people with disabilities, and from those groups, seeking to assist individuals with disabilities in other ways, such as providing direct services or changing community attitudes. There were also many charitable or social service organizations where the leaders of these organizations were non-disabled. For many people with disabilities, having these organizations controlled by people with disabilities is an essential part of the organization. The leaders must be homophilous in this case. Therefore, many organizations, whether formally or informally, require that the majority of the leaders have disabilities. There isn't a distinction between disability rights advocates between an organization of people with disabilities and an organization for people with disabilities. One important aspect of the social system is the role of opinion leaders, and it is important that opinion leaders be homophilous. As we discussed, Rogers defined homophilia as the degree to which two or more individuals who interact are similar in certain attributes such as beliefs, education, socio-economic status, and the like. In a free choice situation, an individual can interact with any one of a number of other individuals. Their tendency is to select someone who is very similar to them. Two examples of opinion leaders were discussed by Richard Scott in Politics and Policy in the History of the Disability Rights Movement. Here he talked about two opinion leaders in the two passages. Ed Roberts, who is a post-polio quadriplegic who uses a wheelchair, was one of the first severely disabled people to attend the University of California at Berkeley. As a student, he pressed the university into accommodating his disability. Because of the lack of accessible housing, Roberts resided at a university health facility along with several other students with severe disabilities. In 1970, with the assistance of federal funding, these students initiated a program on the Berkeley campus to provide disabled students with peer counseling and support in gaining access to university programs, housing, and personal attendance services. Roberts and other disabled student leaders insisted that people with disabilities knew their own needs best, and therefore programs to meet these needs must be controlled by disabled people, and that people with disabilities must integrate themselves into the broader community in order to avoid dependency. Throughout the late 1960s and early 1970s, the number of students at Berkeley who had disabilities increased dramatically, in large part because of the increasing accessibility to the campus and the university's programs. People from outside the university community also sought assistance from the Disabled Students Program. In 1972, Roberts and others, taking the model of the university program into the community, established the Berkeley Center for Independent Living, the CIL, in an apartment near campus. Within the first few months, with a federal grant, CIL was firmly established as the first independent living center in the U.S. Another example of an opinion leader is Judy Heumann. In 1970, Judy Heumann, a graduate of Long Island University and post-polio paraplegic, filed a widely publicized lawsuit when she was denied teaching certification because of her disability. Heumann used a network of peers and with diverse disabilities, many of whom she had met as participants and staff members in a summer recreational program for disabled children. At the Organizational Core for Disabled in Action, DIA, a group of about 80 people which sought to break down barriers to disabled people's full societal participation. By the spring of 1972, DIA had 1,500 members in several cities predominantly on the East Coast. Its protests were targeted at inaccessible public buildings. The Jerry Lewis telethon with disability rights activists accused of perpetuating demeaning stereotypes and media organizations which were believed to neglect or provide fiducial coverage of disability issues. The group also blocked traffic in front of the Richard Nixon 1972 New York campaign headquarters to protest his vetoing of the Rehabilitation Act, and held a march of 150 disability rights activists in Washington when Nixon vetoed the act again after Congress had passed a revised version. Such demonstrations received major media attention and widespread expressions of popular support, in part because they were conducted by people using canes or wheelchairs. Many more people with disabilities were consequently prompted to political action because of these events, and newly organized groups in communities across the country often modeled themselves after the DIA and other prominent organizations. What we see here is that opinion leaders are especially important. Opinion leadership, according to Rogers, is the degree to which an individual is able to influence other individual attributes or overt behavior informally in a desired way with relative frequency. These two opinion leaders were both innovative, homophilious, and reflected the norms of the community they represented. The disability rights movement until the mid 1970s mostly consisted of loosely structured grassroots efforts in which the disability organizations and individuals only worked with other local groups and sometimes joined together, but for the most part it was very segmented. That all began to change as an informal network of 150 different individuals came together to form the American Coalition of Citizens with Disability, also known as the ACCD, with about 65 national and local affiliated organizations. The need for resources and linkages essentially empowered the disability rights movement, and the disability rights leaders began to make their national institutionalized presence known in Washington. As I mentioned earlier, many of the policy goals that the leaders of the disability rights movement adopted or reinvented from other movements. For example, the language in the statute prohibiting discrimination on the basis of disability were taken from laws concerning racial, religious, or gender discrimination on the local, state, and national level. For some existing laws and anti-discrimination statutes, they simply amended disability as a category. Title V was added to the Rehabilitation Act, prohibiting discrimination on the basis of disability by recipients of federal grants, contracted, and other federally operated organizations, using the language that was in Title IV of the 1964 Civil Rights Act and Title IX of the Education Amendment of 1972. The implementation of the legislation by the federal government had major implications on the disability rights movement, as federal agencies were able to pay disability rights organizations to provide technical assistance, organize public education campaigns, and mobilize more opinion leaders to influence the government. The federal legislation and regulations allowed the language of disabilities to be integrated into everyday life, as disability rights activists were able to take a greater role in Washington. As the role became more institutionalized, disability rights advocates were accepted into formal and informal roles of government. The movement continued to grow as local groups organized around issues of implementation and enforcement of requiring for accessibility for mass transit, public facilities, and education. Legal advocacy expanded as a result of claims under the new statutory protections. Public interest law centers and individual attorneys developed expertise in litigating disability rights cases. By the late 1970s, the disability rights movement had most of the ideological and structural attributes that sociologists associated with the social movement. It had developed a coherent set of beliefs and values about the problems faced by people with disabilities in American society, and a network of national and local organizations which would link together structurally and ideologically. By the late 1970s, the disability rights movement became a major player in Washington in terms of lobbying and disability rights, and independent living organizations began to receive significant funding from the federal government. However, this began to change in 1978 as many interest groups, which included other recipients receiving funds from the federal government, such as the VA, began protesting the new federal anti-discrimination laws. The 1978 Rehabilitation Act amendments would be the last major legislative of the disability rights until the ADA. As federal funds became severely limited in the 1980s, debate over reduced budgets, deregulation, and judicial decisions that threatened previously established guarantees began to emerge. Relations between government officials and the leaders of the movement became more distant and adversarial. In the context of the ADA, we see that social structure played a major role in the diffusion of the ADA. Rogers defines structure as the pattern arrangement of the units in the system. The disability movement moved from an informal structure to a more formal structure, therefore reducing uncertainty by allowing one to predict behavior. Lastly, the ADA changed the norms of society by integrating people with disabilities into all aspects of society. The ADA has a long diffusion process to become compatible with the values, beliefs, and past experiences in the social system of having rights. Through the innovation of the disability rights movement, the communication channels of organizations, time, and the social structure, we see that the ADA moved to the innovation decision process.